Today, on Starfield Essentials, I share how to run Starfield on Linux. I'll cover these topics: hardware concerns, choosing a distro, basic gaming with Steam, advanced topics, overclocking and/or undervolting your GPU, replacing GPU DLLs, Steam launch commands, performance monitoring with MangoHud, modding with a mod manager. My name is Richard. Let's get started. Hardware concerns. Let's start with the hardware you need to run Starfield and dispel a myth or two. If your current computer can run Starfield on Windows, it can probably run Starfield on Linux. You may have heard that Linux is better for running games. The fact is, anyone who runs reputable benchmarks over many games is still finding that, on average, Windows outperforms Linux. For example, the latest benchmarking video by Ancient Gameplays compared Windows 11 to CachyOS, Bazzite, and PikaOS on AMD and Nvidia GPUs. The video showed these results. On an AMD GPU at 1440p, Windows outperformed Linux by 6 to 10%. On an Nvidia GPU at 1440p, Windows outperformed Linux by 17 to 19%. On an AMD GPU at 4K, Windows outperformed Linux by 9 to 18%. And on an Nvidia GPU at 4K, Windows outperformed Linux by 15 to 20%. In my own testing, CachyOS has been the best performer for Starfield. When compared against Windows 11 on my NVIDIA 4070 Ti Super, Windows provides about a 12% FPS improvement over CachyOS at 4K. I'll talk more about how I configured CachyOS for this benchmark later. While still being down by 12%, this is a massive improvement. When I did benchmarks for my last video about Starfield on Linux in 2025, I reported that I had seen hits of almost 40% in graphically intense areas of the game. This tendency for Linux to run worse on NVIDIA hardware is called the NVIDIA tax. There's been a ton of work done in the last 9 months to improve the situation, though. I'm confident that it will continue to improve, but you probably want a modern AMD GPU if you are looking to run Linux for gaming and have no interest in Windows. AMD GPUs do not pay the NVIDIA tax, but when AMD releases new cards with new features, it takes months for the open source drivers to offer those new capabilities to gamers. NVIDIA, on the other hand, has day one support for Windows, Linux, and even FreeBSD, but currently there is a price to pay and slightly worse performance. Whatever the case, there's no need to switch to Linux if better performance with Starfield is your primary goal. It's just not there yet. There are plenty of other advantages, which I will share in the conclusion. Regarding inputs and sound, for the most trouble-free experience, I recommend using a wired controller and headset or speakers. Yes, you could use a Bluetooth controller and sound device with Linux, but many of you will dual boot. When switching between the two operating systems, you may encounter issues with hardware connectivity. I mitigate this by using a wired Xbox controller and headset. If you wonder whether your hardware will work with Linux, you can boot just about every distro in live mode and test if Linux recognizes it and supports it. I know that RAM and hardware prices are ridiculous now, but if possible, I would experiment with Linux on a second SSD. If you want to switch to Linux, install your distro on that second SSD and store your original Windows installation for safekeeping. That way, if something goes terribly wrong, you can easily switch back to Windows. I also recommend keeping Windows on one SSD and putting Linux on a second SSD if you plan to dual boot. It's not strictly necessary to do this, but it can avoid some problems. Personally, I multi-boot with Windows and 4 Linux distros. In other words, I have Windows on the first SSD and 4 Linux distros on a second SSD, so I am familiar with complex booting scenarios. I don't recommend multi-booting if you're a beginner. Just remove your Windows SSD, swap in a spare SSD for Linux, and do your experimenting there with a single Linux installation. Microsoft does not intentionally fiddle with bootloaders to stop Linux from working. Some users have reported issues over the years, but Microsoft isn't pursuing a DOS ain't done until Lotus won't run strategy. That was a myth too. Finally, if you have Secure Boot enabled in your BIOS, it may not work with some Linux distros. Some distros like Linux Mint and Bazzite support Secure Boot out of the box, while others require manual configuration. Sometimes it's just easier to disable Secure Boot in the BIOS. Despite what you might have read on Reddit or elsewhere, Secure Boot is not a Microsoft conspiracy to lock out other operating systems. But Secure Boot is broken! Look, Secure Boot is software, and all software has vulnerabilities. We patch and we move on. Next, choosing a distro. Most of us are basically stuck with the hardware we have, so choosing a distro is usually the most important decision for running Starfield on Linux. In the Linux world, choosing a distro seems like a religious practice. If you're not running my distro, you are an infidel who must be converted or downvoted into oblivion. Here are the factors to consider when choosing a distro. Gaming versus non-gaming. Over the last decade, several Linux distros devoted to gaming have become popular. This chart from the Boiling Steam website demonstrates the rise and fall of various Linux distros used for gaming beginning in 2019. The massive orange section representing Ubuntu, a general-purpose distro, has withered over time, while distros like CachyOS have grown from basically nothing in 2024 to the top spot in June 2026. While CachyOS is not strictly a gaming distro, it is designed for high-performance desktop use. Bazzite is an example of a gaming distro that has grown from basically nothing in 2024, but it is not yet as popular as other distros. Rolling versus long-term support. So-called rolling distributions are constantly updated. Every time you log in, there's likely an update to something waiting to be installed. CachyOS and PikaOS are examples of rolling distros. Bazzite also qualifies, but its atomic architecture achieves this differently. LTS or long-term support distros are updated less frequently, but more importantly, they tend to stick with the same software versions for the duration of their specific version number. They may offer kernel updates and upgrades to key software like the Firefox web browser, but otherwise, updates are integrations of security patches. Linux Mint is an example of an LTS distro, as it is basically a reskin of Ubuntu, which in itself is derived from Debian. Linux base distro. Remember that Linux is a kernel. A distro is built around the kernel. There are a few base distributions which serve as the building blocks for dozens of other Linux distros. They have many similarities and differences, but often their packaging format is an easy way to identify them. The most significant base distros for gaming are Debian, which is the base for Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and PikaOS, Fedora, which is the base for Nobara and Bazzite, and Arch Linux, which is the base for SteamOS, Manjaro, and CachyOS. OpenSUSE, Slackware, Gentoo, and Alpine Linux are a few other prominent base distros. To get a sense of some of the distros out there, check out this chart by Cody Wohlers. I've outlined in red the distros I use regularly. With all this in mind, how do you choose a distro? First, if you have experience with or affinity for a certain base distro, then I would lean in that direction. I've used Debian for over 25 years, so I'm predisposed towards distros based on Debian, or even Debian itself. Second, if you have very new hardware, you'll probably want to avoid a long-term support distro in favor of a rolling distro. There are wars fought on Reddit between people running different distros, hardware, and games, but it's worth trying several distros to see which works best with your hardware. One of the problems with PC gaming is that no two people have the same setup. Something which works for one person might not work for another. Experimentation is required to get the best results. Technically, you could probably get anything to work with any distro, so long as you can configure support in the Linux kernel and associated applications. Most people don't want to bother with that, so choose a distro that does the work for you. Third, do you want access to the absolute latest software and features? If yes, a rolling distro is the way to go. There are some ways to access newer software in so-called stable distros, like Debian, perhaps via a system called backports. But if the cutting edge is a core priority, just pick a rolling distro. Given these three variables, I choose to regularly run 4 different Linux distros on my gaming PC and laptop. I run Linux Mint for access to a stable Ubuntu and Debian derivative. Mint removes parts of Ubuntu I don't like, such as snap packages, and is beginner-friendly. I'll probably retire Mint in favor of TuxedoOS once they rebase to use Debian. Note that Mint is basically the last big distro currently running the ancient X11 protocol for desktop support. Everyone else has transitioned to Wayland. Mint is supposed to offer Wayland support in Mint 23 in late December, although X11 will remain the default, and I'm aware that there is Wayland in Mint right now, but it's not working that great. I run Bazzite for a pure gaming experience. Bazzite is the distro of choice for many who want to replicate a gaming console environment. This distro is unique because it uses a version-locked atomic upgrade system. I've had mixed results though, with one system showing screen flickering. I like that Bazzite supports secure boot out of the box. I run PikaOS to have a gaming experience based on the Debian Unstable or SID branch, the most cutting-edge but risky form of Debian. PikaOS is a newer distro, and I've had a few rough encounters with it. I run CachyOS for pure desktop performance. It's highly tuned but susceptible to breaking, although I haven't had any problems yet. You'll get the most out of CachyOS, but you might have to fix it along the way, and you'll always be seeing that update notice. The bottom line is to set yourself up for success by experimenting in a way that does not ruin your Windows installation. That's assuming you have a Windows installation. Next, basic gaming with Steam. Starfield is available on Steam, and Steam supports Linux gaming. In fact, Steam is really the reason there is Linux gaming, at least to the degree that it works so well today. Linux does not support running the Xbox for PC version of Starfield. For basic use, make sure Steam is installed on your Linux system. Gaming distros usually come with Steam pre-installed, while generic distros like Linux Mint offer Steam in the Distro App Store. Steam handles updates on its own each time you start it. After you install Starfield, you should simply be able to play the game. This is the starting point for anyone not familiar with Linux gaming. In the advanced topics section, I'll get into customizing your setup. I always run Steam in a terminal. I like to see the messages it reports because they can help with troubleshooting. If your game does not run in this vanilla mode, then some customization might be needed. I don't recommend starting with customizations though, especially if you're new. At this point, the game should behave as it does in Windows. You can enable creations via the in-game system, just as you would on console or Windows. This is the absolute easiest way to run mods on PC on Linux. I'll cover PC modding methods, not creations, later. Next, advanced topics. In this section, I'm going to cover topics that are optional, but will tune your system for the best possible performance. I must warn you that the content in this section is the most sensitive to change. Linux game support is a highly active area for development. I recommend comparing anything I display in this part of the video with the latest information online. Someone is always releasing a better application or changing software parameters or making other changes that make some advice obsolete. Overclocking and/or undervolting your GPU. On Windows, you may have used something like MSI Afterburner to overclock and/or undervolt your GPU. I do this on Windows myself. Undervolting keeps my GPU cooler and prevents thermal throttling. There are two primary contenders for Linux. The first is Lacked by Ilya Zlobintsev. Using this tool, I reproduced the undervolt and fan curves I created in MSI Afterburner and applied them to Linux. Once I set up a stable undervolt on one Linux distro, I simply copy the config.yaml to each of my other Linux distros. If you're not comfortable setting up your own undervolt, then you might try Penguin Burner by Jan Pitek. Penguin Burner runs through a series of tests to generate an undervolt that may or may not work with Starfield. It's still a great starting point, because you can try less aggressive settings after Penguin Burner proposes its efficiency, balanced, and performance options. I have a 1003 MHz VRAM overclock on MSI Afterburner, but I haven't yet tried overclocking my VRAM on Linux. It's a little more complicated, but I'll give it a try at some point. Replacing GPU DLLs. If you run vanilla Starfield, it uses the DLSS libraries shipped with the original game in 2023. These lack many new features that are worth implementing now. There are two ways to accomplish this. The first is to use a program like DLSS Updater by Recall or Deco. This program works equally well on Windows or Linux. On Linux, I use the Flatpak. When I first launched it, the program couldn't find my games. That's the result of the Flatpak security model. You need to give the program permissions to access different file locations. A program like FlatSeal will take care of that for you. You use DLSS Swapper to simply change out the original DLSS DLLs for newer versions. When Starfield runs, it will use the files it sees and give you access to better upscaling models and presets. Unfortunately for AMD users, Starfield does not support easy DLL swapping because Starfield uses FSR 3.0. The game would need to natively support FSR 3.1 or higher to enable DLL swapping for AMD libraries. It is possible to trick Starfield into running FSR 3.1 and higher, like FSR 4, using OptiScaler. OptiScaler essentially uses DLSS outputs fed into newer FSR libraries to support AMD GPUs. I don't own any AMD GPUs, so please check out one of the many other videos explaining how to set up OptiScaler on Linux. You don't necessarily need to swap files if you use the options in the next section. Steam Proton version and launch commands. Now we get into some deep voodoo, and you know what rhymes with voodoo. Proton is a compatibility layer that translates Windows calls like DX12 into Linux equivalents like Vulkan. On Steam, you can choose different Proton versions when you run a game. I typically run Proton Experimental with Starfield. On CachyOS, I use the Proton version specifically packaged with CachyOS. If you want to add other Proton versions for testing or performance reasons, I recommend using a tool like Proton OpQT or Proton Plus. After choosing a Proton version, you can customize how Steam runs Starfield using launch commands passed to the game at runtime. These can accomplish all sorts of tasks. Let me show you the launch command I use on CachyOS. Good grief, what is all that? Let me explain. Here's a quick breakdown of what each of those environment variables and launch commands does for your Linux gaming setup. And rather than go through all of them, I'm just going to put them on the screen and you can pause and read and see what each one does. You may have noticed I mentioned MangoHud at the top. I'll say more about MangoHud in the next section, but assembling the other parameters has taken a lot of work. If you want help with these commands, a newer program that may help is Proton Forge by Renee H. I ran it as a Flatpak using this command. You can use the program to get some of these options in your launch command, but you can't trust all of it. For example, the default frame rate limitation option in Proton Forge does not support DX12. It created this for me, but that will not work with DX12 games. I needed this instead. Also, it doesn't expose every option. For example, it doesn't have this one, which is needed to enable better performance on Nvidia GPUs. Keep an eye on Proton Forge, but I expect you'll need to do some manual tweaking. Performance monitoring with MangoHud. If you want to see performance statistics for Starfield, Steam's native option works great. I run it in the upper right-hand corner of my screen. If you want more detailed statistics, and especially if you want to collect logging data for comparisons, the only real option is MangoHud by Flightless Mango. If you want my configuration file, just leave me a comment and I'll figure out how to get it to you. Generally, I share news about these videos in r No Sodium Starfield on Reddit, so I can always post it there for you. I use MangoHud to collect performance statistics for Starfield, and I compared them with similar data collected by CapFrameX on Windows. Modding with a mod manager. In previous videos, I've talked about either using the in-game creation system or manually placing mod files in Linux. In the last year, a new Linux native mod manager has made modding on Linux as powerful as options on Windows. I recommend trying Amethyst Mod Manager by Chris DKN. This mod manager will seem familiar to anyone who uses Mod Organizer 2. As a Vortex user on Windows, I was still able to get Amethyst working without any issues. I ran the app image using this command. I had to set the Qt scale factor because I couldn't see the whole application screen without it. Here I'll show you how to set up Amethyst Mod Manager. Here's what you see when you start the Mod Manager. Pretty simple. We'll choose the next step, and we're going to connect to Nexus Mods. And this was very easy. I was able to authorize my connection to Nexus Mods, and then the next step after that was to hit Next. And I accepted the defaults as to where it wanted to store certain files. Amethyst found Starfield and suggested other games. And then I accepted the defaults for this part of the setup. Now here's what you see after that setup process is ready. And we'll try launching Starfield just to make sure everything works, and Starfield did work. So after that, I searched for the Copycat Duplicator, which is a mod I wanted to try, and I installed it. This is so cool just being able to look right there. And now you can see in the left, Copycat Duplicator is installed, and when I launched Starfield, it appeared in game. The next thing I wanted to try was installing the SFSE, which you can do using a wizard, and I changed this from the default to the option that you see here because I want to manage it in the left-hand side. Now, I can't remember if I had already downloaded this or if it downloaded it for me, but eventually the script extender was installed, pretty easy, and it showed that it was not yet deployed, but after I hit the deploy button, it said the script extender was installed. And when I launched Starfield, it had to build shaders. But once that process was done, I opened a console and ran get SFSE version and saw that the script extender was installed. I know there are other options for managing mods on Linux, some of which are native and some of which involve running a Windows program through Wine. Amethyst is a game changer though, because it seems to work so well with Starfield. Finally, while most ESM and BA2 based mods will work with Starfield on Linux, I've had mixed results with using DLL based mods. For example, the Fast Travel to Unknown DLL doesn't seem to work with my current installation on Linux. Let me know what your experience has been with these more complicated configurations. Conclusion. If you think playing Starfield on Linux can get complicated, I agree. It's amazing to think we are playing native Windows games on Linux at all. It used to be impossible aside from native ports. I do remember playing Quake 3 Arena on Red Hat Linux in 1999 with friends and coworkers in the Air Force. Today, thanks to technologies like Wine and Proton and support from developers at Valve, Nvidia, and elsewhere, we can play many games at near Windows level or in some cases slightly better than Windows level. The good news is that a basic setup is pretty straightforward. It really only gets complicated when you're trying to squeeze more performance out of the hardware and software on hand. If Windows is still a superior operating system in terms of sheer performance, why run Linux? Some Linux users just prefer the look and feel of the operating system. They like the more or less integrated package management and the sorts of software available on Linux. Note that if you're looking for a unified package manager for Windows, I highly recommend UniGet UI. It uses the native WinGet package management system, a feature that has been part of Windows for years. Some Linux users don't like what they perceive as bloat in Windows, and others fear that Windows shares too much about them with Microsoft. We saw this recently with the Windows Global Device Identifier, or GDID, revelation. If you're looking to debloat and streamline your Windows setup, I highly recommend trying WinHance. Finally, I conducted a poll last week asking how many of you use Linux. As you can see, with 258 votes at the time of recording, 11% of you use Linux as your primary gaming OS for Starfield, with another 3% dual booting. 31% of you do not use Linux but are interested, and the majority, 55%, have no interest. I hope viewers of all camps enjoyed this video. Thank you, developers, for your work. And thank you to all my subscribers. Please consider subscribing to show YouTube that you enjoy positive and honest Starfield content. In addition to videos, I also post to the community tab for this channel on a daily basis. If you subscribe, you'll see these posts in your YouTube feed. Special thanks to all channel members. I hope you're enjoying our private Discord server, early access to these videos, and members-only live streams. I promise I'll have another one soon. If you'd like to know more about membership, click the join button on the channel. I use your contributions to pay for drives for capturing footage, to buy creations to review, and to pay the monthly fee for StreamYard, which I use for live streams. If you made it to this part of the video, please leave a comment with the word penguin. Check out my other videos, and please tell your friends about the channel. My name is Richard. I will see you in the Starfield.